Hello and welcome to the Winter 2021 University of Washington Food Systems Seminar on Food Supply Chains during the COVID-19 pandemic. We are living through very challenging times. This seminar will provide opportunity to engage with current issues through a food systems lens, where we will explore how issues are interconnected across the supply chains and across food systems. My name is Dr. Yona Sipos, and I am your instructor for the seminar. I'm pleased to be with you today and each week to host a different guest to speak on our theme. I'll be providing the first lecture today, which will include an introduction to food systems during COVID-19, as well as an introduction to the seminar and what to expect this quarter. So first, let's take a moment to ground ourselves. The study of food systems is inextricably tied to both planetary and population health, and there is great benefit to zooming in on a particular place. And so we hold a global planetary perspective and also zoom in to the Pacific Northwest of the United States, to the Cascadia bioregion and the Salish Sea, to Seattle, King County, and to acknowledge these lands and waterways as traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Duwamish, Suquamish, Muckleshoot, Tulalip, and other Coast Salish tribes and nations who are still here. Our focus in this seminar is on food systems, and this quarter will focus further on food supply chains, which inextricably link people to the planet through both land and labor. So we'll also include a labor acknowledgement to center and lift up the too often invisible work of Indigenous, African American and Black, Asian and Latinx communities. These communities' labor and stewardship through slavery, unpaid and underpaid labor has and continues to build up the wealth and prosperity of this land, including for uninvited settlers. So today I will be introducing food systems to you, including the current context for food systems, primarily with respect to the public health pandemic, but we'll connect to a couple of major issues or of additional major issues or crises. We'll begin to center food supply chains to set you up for the upcoming quarter of guest experts who will expand our landscape of understanding food systems while focusing on food supply chains at various scales from the very local to the global. I'll also share with you or introduce with you the concepts of resilience, sustainability, and equity as they relate to the food system. And then we'll go over the seminar schedule, syllabus highlights, and seminar expectations, which you may have already reviewed or started to review on Canvas. So we are living through various kinds of threats, including the public health pandemics of COVID-19 and systemic racism, and the existential threat of climate change and accompanying climate chaos. These threats all impact land and labor, as mentioned before, but also livelihoods, the means of securing the necessities of life. So whether it's our natural resources, ecological goods and services that are being compromised, or whether it's that entire food system sectors have shut down, people's ability to pursue the necessities of life, to secure the necessities of life, are being compromised. And these challenging conditions, at least for COVID, consist of over 20 million cases in the United States alone and over 350,000 deaths nationally. That is the primary context for us to explore stresses on food supply chains and the food systems and our food systems at this time. These were the Associated Press headlines from yesterday. We are living in times of great flux and rapid news cycles. These can cause extreme emotions, extreme stress, and I encourage you and the University of Washington and the President of the University of Washington, at all scales, we encourage you to seek out the support and the resources that you need to move with grace through these extremely challenging times. What happened on Wednesday in the US Capitol building with a mob overtaking the building, the left headline, is shocking and alarming, The president, as I mentioned, has sent out a message or even a couple of messages indicating the same and pointing students to resources that are available. I encourage you to read her message and find the support that you need. On the other hand, we're about to cross the threshold into a new government and a new context for decision-making that's about to emerge in the United States. This will also have implications for our food systems and for the intertwined crises of climate change and systemic racism as well, or at least to social issues that relate to racial equity and justice. But what's been in the news for even longer than headlines from a couple of days ago is this growing concern of food insecurity within Washington state, across America, and around the world, due primarily at this time to the public health crisis that has triggered economic insecurity that bisects with systemic racism. It is important to note, though, that food insecurity worldwide was already increasing, in large part likely due to climate change that is already occurring around the world. And food systems were already at the crux of many crises. Over the last 50 years, global food production has increased by nearly 300%, thanks to our incredible ability to innovate. And yet the number of people going to bed hungry each night also rose to 690 million in 2019, an increase of 60 million in just 5 years. That was pre-COVID. At the same time, the number of people who are obese or suffer from food-related diseases now stands at more than 2 billion. But we also continue to waste over a third of all the food we produce, a loss of more than $900 billion every year. Globally, our food systems contribute to negative ecological impacts and degradation, including the loss of biodiversity, topsoil, and clean freshwater. Food systems contribute significantly to climate change, which in turn exacerbates environmental impacts. Consolidation of power across industries increasingly controls entire food supply chains all the way to markets and food environments, including advertising to children. As illustrated starkly during the COVID-19 pandemic, our food system is not always resilient to shocks or sustainable by various measures. Our food systems are fundamentally inequitable in many ways and often disproportionately burden and deny access to communities of color and those experiencing high poverty. At this time, although the world produces more than enough food to feed everyone, our food systems are out of balance. The added stress of COVID-19 is putting additional stresses on our food supply chains, and we'll talk about that next, within the context of food systems. So what are food systems? The Food and Agriculture Organization, or the FAO of the United Nations, depicts food systems as food supply chains, circled over here on the left, that are impacted by various drivers up here at the top, including biophysical drivers, environmental, political, sociocultural, economic drivers that impact the supply chains that produce, process, and distribute foods to food environments such as retail, or food banks for consumers who will ultimately have diet, nutrition, and health outcomes. This perspective portrays a systems approach to food with the goal being food security. And food security here is defined as availability, access, and utilization. That's defined here at the bottom. It's important to note that food security can also consider how the food is produced, how the people who are producing the food are being treated, and how decisions are made throughout the food supply chain. But often that's not included in the definition of food security, and it really is summarized by a focus on availability, access, and utilization. So back to food supply chains, this rather linear depiction of food supply chains shows the production, storage and distribution, processing and packaging, retail and markets, the processes that turn the field ingredients into the food that we eat. So the wheat into the bread, if you will. Here we see some basic differences between a linear and a circular depiction of supply chain models that, as described, take these raw materials and turn them into foods that we can access and ultimately consume. Here you can see on the left, the linear food supply chain shows the raw material moving through suppliers and manufacturers, distributors, until it gets to the consumer. But what do you notice in the circular supply chain that is not mentioned, is not considered within the linear supply chain? Right away for me, what jumps out is the focus on byproducts that are either waste or that can be recycled and reused. This is a really important lack in linear discussions of supply chains because it doesn't take a cradle to grave approach, but it's really just cradle into the landfill. So thinking about it with respect to our food supply, here's a circular depiction of our food supply. And here it's specific to food, so food production, and this would also include harvesting wild resources, including fisheries, distribution, aggregation, processing, marketing, all the way through until we get again to this waste or resource recovery. But it's really important to understand that these are very simplified, oversimplified depictions of incredibly extended, complicated, and complex realities of interconnected national and global food systems. And a better depiction of those global food systems would be something like this. It's still a simple approximation with, sectors that are depicted within one word or an icon connected by arrows to other sectors and other actors. But essentially, we are looking at a system of systems that are both, as mentioned before, complicated and complex as we move from a seemingly straightforward supply chain to conceptualizing a global food system. So here is a kind of middle ground. So here is a simplified view of the complexity of food systems, of the system of systems that interact to enable our food supply, which you'll see is right here in the center. I especially like this image though, because it includes something that has still been missing from the other food system graphics. So I'm going to give you a moment here to take a look and to see it. Yes, people. People are populated within this depiction of food systems. People who are farmers, ranchers, fishers, harvesters, the food chain workers, or the labor force, the consumers, at every stage along the food supply chain, and even embedded within the drivers of the food supply chain and in the outcomes. So within the whole food system, people are often forgotten, but we really have an opportunity and obligation to center people, to draw attention to people, because that's what this endeavor is all about. It's population health within the context of planetary health. Here are some headlines that are, I think, just local and national headlines from the spring and fall. And again, you take a moment to review these headlines, some of which you probably saw in the last 6 months or so, 8 months. And what do you notice? What I notice here is that the shocks are all affecting aspects of the food system, specifically supply chains, different aspects of supply chains, which are showing either strain or stress coming close to breaking, in large part, and in some cases due entirely due to costs of human capital, labor. So putting people at the center of our food systems is essential because we are absolutely reliant on human labor throughout our food supply chain and throughout food systems. So as a small example, with our borders closed for much of the last 9 months, there were all of a sudden huge questions about who would be able to be the agricultural labor force that would be allowed to migrate into the country, legally or otherwise, in order to do the labor that we fundamentally depend on, that we in fact deem to be essential as part of the coronavirus response. And that is at risk because of the shocks to our social systems, our political systems, and our food systems, including our food supply chains. At the same time, it's really important to make this point clear, which is that all in all, our food supply chains are responding remarkably well. And Anne Goodchild, Dr. Anne Goodchild, who heads up the Supply Chain Transportation and Logistics Center here at the University of Washington, has stated recently that overwhelmingly we are experiencing a story of resilience and adaptation that actually shows the strength of the supply chains that have been able to, for the most part, keep up with demand. So in reviewing some of the required readings for today's lecture, in recalling back to March and April what your experiences may have included, you may recall empty store shelves in grocery stores, right? Where certain items were just not available. And we're going to hear from a grocery supplier, we're going to hear from other experts in the field who can speak more eloquently to this or in more detail to this. But that wasn't a supply chain issue so much as it was a stocking issue at the tail end. There were some shortages, minor shortages, but there was nothing extended. There has certainly been strain put on our food supply chain, but overall, we are experiencing a rather adaptive and resilient supply chain, which is the really good news. The challenge is that it comes at a cost. And when we start to populate our food system understanding, our food system graphics, including our food supply chain graphics with labor, with people who are an essential capital for food systems and food supply chains to function, then we realize that it was food chain labor that allows for that the food supply chains to be resilient, but it comes at a great cost to the individuals, to the communities, and to the future of those industries potentially. The story is still unfolding. This quarter will allow you to explore some of these issues, especially because we continue to live through this huge period of impact, adaptation, and potentially transformation of our food systems, including parts of our food supply chains, even here in the United States. So the United States has two relatively distinct supply chains. One, this was pre-COVID, let's say, one that supplies grocery stores for home use, and one that supplies the food service industries, including large institutions like schools and hospitals and restaurant service industry. When the coronavirus pandemic forced restaurants, for example, to close and schools to close and new protocols to be introduced to many of our institutions, that whole supply chain was left in limbo. That was the impact on the supply chain, and there has been this evolving response through series of adaptations that is allowing that food, instead of not having anywhere to go and being wasted, as we saw early in the pandemic, to actually be incorporated into our either grocery store supply chain or into other creative ways of keeping that food and nutrition within the supply chain, ultimately reaching individuals and communities to ensure nutrition and health outcomes. Food system resilience is the term that's used to describe the capacity of a food system and its component parts to withstand or bounce back after a disturbance or shock. So we are not in the period after the disturbance or shock. We are still living through it, but we have already seen, and we are already seeing ways that our food supply chains and ultimately our food system has been able to respond by either bouncing back or adapting after the shock of the pandemic. And we'll be exploring case studies and examples of that over the course of this quarter. Sometimes food system resilience is described really as the capacity of a food system and its component parts to provide food security over time and despite disturbances. And that's a really useful proxy for food system resilience, but it doesn't always take into account that food insecurity is very closely tied to economic insecurity. And so the food insecurity that is being experienced, the increases in food insecurity being experienced locally, across the country, and globally, but certainly within the country, is largely an economic issue. So it's not because our food supply chains broke. It's not because we don't have enough food to feed hungry people. It's almost always an economic issue here in the United States, where people are not able to afford to purchase the foods that will allow them to experience food and nutrition security. One more note on resilience, that resilience can sometimes be understood in opposition to efficiency, where resilience will help to address and provide some buffer to the efficiency approach of our just-in-time supply chains. And there's an article that I encourage you to dig into that explores that just-in-time supply chain that we've come to rely on, including for our food supply, that in part resulted in some delays you might have seen in stocked grocery shelves. Sustainable food systems starts to take a more fleshed out approach than kind of the simple food security measure that is often used as a proxy for resilient food systems. So sustainable food systems really see this idea of food and nutrition security, which is the need to provide food and nutrition that that is available, accessible, affordable, but in the case of sustainable food systems, that is also produced in ways that are environmentally sound, that are ecologically and socially just, and that provide healthy food to meet current needs, but also with an eye toward maintaining healthy ecosystems to provide food for generations to come. So it takes this idea of being able to respond to a shock and fleshes it out to more of an ideal food system in the short, medium, and long term, so that it can be ongoing. One other element that we'll be including in this class is the idea of equitable food systems. And equitable food systems is really an emerging paradigm where all people can fully participate, prosper, and benefit in and from the food system. Equitable food systems really focuses on economic opportunity so that people are able to experience high quality jobs with living wages, safe working conditions, access to healthy food, healthy, affordable, and culturally appropriate food. But it also does so with a concurrent focus on environmental sustainability, similar to sustainable food systems, but takes all of this a little bit further by also focusing on who has decision-making power. So how do we ensure that our food systems are also including the most vulnerable and those living in low-income neighborhoods and communities of color, those who are disenfranchised or on the margins, who should have an opportunity to have decision-making power about the foods that are appropriate for them, their families, and their culture, that are produced in safe ways, and that are available and affordable for access. So looking at resilient food systems, sustainable food systems, and equitable food systems as our guiding lights as we explore food supply chain questions is something that we'll encourage you to keep coming back to, especially as you reflect on the seminars that are coming up and have a chance ultimately to reflect on the seminar as a whole. So each week we have between 2 and 4 required readings or required resources that we call our pre-lecture resources, and these include readings, Usually they are, we try to keep them quite accessible and short. Sometimes there are longer reports. Sometimes there's some primary research, but we usually turn to the gray literature for synthesis of some of the emerging research. Sometimes there'll be videos to review, and we'll ask you to review those required readings before you watch the seminar presentations to help you prepare. But then you might want to go back to some of those and to explore the recommended readings as well throughout the quarter, and certainly as you write reflections after the seminars. And even if you don't have a chance to read every single article, some weeks the list may be a little long, but I encourage you to do your best to at least open them up, at least skim the readings, listen to the videos on 1.5 times speed, and do your best to really use this opportunity to engage in this very current and rapidly evolving issue of our time. To that end, we have put together a truly interdisciplinary agenda for you, individuals from across campus and from various positions within community, government, NGOs, pairing of a range of different topics and sectors and scales within our food supply chains. And so I'm not going to read all of these out, but notice that we have engineers and farmers and global consultants and researchers from nutrition, researchers who are working, researchers from communities as well, indigenous communities, talking about food sovereignty, and then the opportunity to contrast global food system resource mobilization with our statewide focus on food policy, which is our statewide Washington Food Policy Forum. So we're really excited to bring this lineup to you, and we hope that it's going to be, we hope and anticipate that it will be a quarter of rich and varied learning. New lectures will be posted on Canvas every Friday at 12:30 p.m. Midday, and the readings will be posted a week before the new lectures are posted. I think I've shared most of this already. Please spend time on Canvas familiarizing yourself with where the information is found. Under modules, every week we will have a collection of the readings, the lecture recording, a PDF of the PowerPoint slides or of the slides that were used, and any other relevant information, including assignments, reflections that are due. That's all within modules. It's all linked on Canvas. If you have questions, please take a little bit of time to first try to explore and find the answer yourself. And then as needed, please feel free to communicate with Matt Goldberg, who's the reader grader for the seminar, or me via Canvas messaging only. So we don't want any email, UW email messages to get lost. Please use Canvas messaging. We hope that by the end of this seminar, you will have had an opportunity to engage with key readings, concepts, and leading thinkers and actors across food systems, nutrition, and health. We'll be covering, as I mentioned, local to global efforts, and you will have an opportunity to hear from a variety of perspectives, diversity of viewpoints and approaches. You will be tasked with synthesizing and writing critiques on some of these lectures, and we'll talk about that next. And so for the Nutrition 400 students, not those signed up for the 500 level, but for the Nutrition 400 students, you will have weekly submission opportunities, except for the first and last week. So there are 8 weeks in between, and you will have an opportunity to submit a reflection each of those 8 weeks, but only 5 submissions will be counted. And so you can choose to just submit 5 reflections over the quarter. And these are due the Tuesday following the lecture. So the lecture will be available on Friday afternoons, and then the following Tuesday, the weekly submission will be due. So Matt and I are still putting the final touches on making those available to you, but we're thinking that we're actually going to use the quiz function on Canvas as a way for you to submit your reflections. It'll make the grading a little bit easier. We have over 330 students enrolled in this class, which is quite amazing, from every single program across the university. And we're so grateful that you're all here. And so we're just trying to streamline some of our processes for running the seminar. And that information will be available very soon on Canvas, if it's not there already by the time you're watching this. Yes, so just to wrap that up, weekly submission opportunities, 5 will be counted at 10% each. This is a credit, no credit seminar, and you need to achieve 75% in order to get the credit. Our goal is for every single one of you to get the credit, just to be transparent about it, okay? The reason we only count the top 5 submissions is also to give you flexibility. And if there are weeks where you're overloaded or you're unable to complete a reflection, no problem. You only need to complete 5, but it's up to you to track that over the quarter, because there are no late weekly submissions accepted at all. Please don't ask. For the Nutrition 500 students, you're not required to submit regular reflections, but we will have you submit a summative synthesis and reflection due with the final, it says here final vision paper, it should just say final paper, which is due on the first Monday during exam week on March 15th. More detail on that, about the specifics of that summative synthesis, are on Canvas. The final assignment, which is for both Nutrition 4 and 500 students, as mentioned, is due on Monday, March 15th. It's worth 50% of your grade. And as mentioned, you only need 75% of total points to receive the seminar credit. For the final 1-page assignment, more detail is coming soon on Canvas, but it is just 1 page. It will draw on the seminar and it will draw on your readings and will allow you some opportunity to both finish your synthesis and also think about challenges and potential solutions to our seminar topic. So as a recap, we just have this table that is also posted, I believe, on the homepage, but certainly on the syllabus page of Canvas, with a quick reminder of how points are allocated and a reminder to please do your best to view each lecture in order to get the most out of every seminar. So even if there's a week where you're not planning on submitting a reflection, I encourage you to watch the video, both for your own learning and to honor our speakers' expertise and time. Lots more detail about the course is available in the syllabus on Canvas. But know that our goal is to help you succeed in the seminar, to learn, to engage, and to receive the credit. So we have under modules some additional links for student support, writing and referencing expectations, as well as guidance for students taking this course from outside of the US. Please spend time checking out the resources that we've posted. And if you need further support or if you have questions, do not hesitate to reach out via Canvas messaging, again, to Matt Goldberg or myself. So with that, I'm going to wrap up this first seminar a little bit early. To start off slow, it's been a very intense week. I hope you make a little bit of time for yourselves and just to process what's happening in the country right now. It's a very dynamic time, and it will continue to be dynamic for the near future. And so I wish you all well. I wish you time for rest and rejuvenation in addition to getting the quarter started. So please take care of yourselves and each other. Be in touch on Canvas if needed. Check out the resources. Prepare for next week by reviewing the resources listed under week 2, and hang in there. Happy New Year. At least we're not still in 2020. Thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to this quarter with all of you.